The chamber is wishing to vote or to change his or her vote. If not, the yeas are 48, the nays are 50, and the motion is not agreed to.
It's okay.
Mr. President,
The senator from Florida.
I call up my amendment number 1395 and ask that it be reported by number.
The clerk will report by number.
I ask unanimous consent.
Senator from Florida, Mr. Scott, proposes an amendment number 1395 to amendment number 891.
Mr. President, I ask unanimous consent for 2 minutes of debate equally divided.
Without objection.
Mr. President, there is no reason this bill should include funding for Amtrak's Northeast Corridor, a woefully mismanaged public railway system that benefits very few Americans. My amendment redirects this wasteful spending to strengthen many of the core missions of our military. For the U.S. Coast Guard, that includes search and rescue, drug and migrant interdiction, cargo and personnel transport, and maritime stewardship. American taxpayers are better spent to support this mission and improve the defense and security of our nation than to prop up wasteful and mismanaged transportation systems in New Jersey, New York, and Massachusetts. My amendment directs nearly $1 billion to the Coast Guard's Super Hercules program to continue their procurement of several HC-130Js, a top-of-class long-range surveillance aircraft, which will strengthen our national defense and border security. I urge my colleagues to join me in support of this amendment. Thank you.
Mr. President.
The senator from Washington.
Mr. President, the sun is coming up in Washington, D.C., and we have spent all night debating policy and questions to arrive at this moment at 6 a.m. with an amendment that is literally robbing Peter to pay Paul. This isn't the idea of a debate. The Amtrak and North Corridor system has basically had to reallocate resources. The 457 corridor, which is one of the busiest in the nation, has over 750,000 people on that system. But because of COVID, it has lost revenue. It has 97% loss of revenue, and now they are making drastic cuts to employees, to services that could become permanent. This simply helps Amtrak and our busiest corridor stay in business. We will address the Coast Guard needs in other legislation. I ask my colleagues to vote no. Stop robbing Peter to pay Paul. Let's fix the COVID crisis on our transportation system.
Questions on the amendment? Is there a sufficient second? There appears to be. The clerk will call the roll.
Baldwin. Mr. Barrasso. Mr. Bennett, Mrs. Blackburn, Mr. Blumenthal. Mr. Blunt, Mr. Booker, Mr. Bozeman, Mr. Braun, Mr. Brown, Mr. Burr, Ms. Cantwell, Mrs. Capito, Mr. Cardin, Mr. Carper, Mr. Casey, Mr. Cassidy, Ms. Collins,
No, thank you.
Mr. Coons, Mr. Cornyn, Ms. Cortez Masto, Mr. Cotton, Mr. Kramer, Mr. Crapo, Mr. Cruz, Mr. Daines, Ms. Duckworth, Mr. Durbin, Ms. Ernst, Mrs. Feinstein, Mrs. Fisher, Mrs. Gillibrand, Mr. Graham, Mr. Grassley, Mr. Haggerty, Mrs. Hassan, Mr. Hawley, Mr. Heinrich, Mr. Hickenlooper, Ms. Hirono, Mr. Hoven, Mrs. Hyde-Smith, Mr. Inhofe, Mr. Johnson, Mr. Kane, Mr. Kelly, Mr. Kennedy, Mr. King, Ms. Klobuchar, Mr. Langford, Mr. Leahy, Mr. Lee, Mr. Lujan, Ms. Lummis, Mr. Manchin, Mr. Markey, Mr. Marshall, Mr. McConnell, Mr. Menendez, Mr. Merkley, Mr. Moran, Ms. Murkowski, Mr. Murphy, Mrs. Murray, Mr. Ossoff, Mr. Padilla, Mr. Paul, Mr. Peters,